Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons, and thank you so much for joining me for the exclusive content for this very first, the inaugural newsletter that I'm sending out. Let me just begin. Thank you so much for subscribing. It really is kind of a strange phenomenon trying to think of myself in some sort of public intellectual way, moving away from being purely an academic author, an academic philosopher, to trying to do philosophy with a little bit broader reach. And so thank you guys so much for affirming that this is worth doing and for encouraging me along the way. Well, today I do want to think with you a little bit more informally than I do on my YouTube videos, and just encourage you to think with me as we wrestle with ideas that really matter. So the idea that I do want to play with a little bit today is, how is it that we become world creators? Now, this is an idea, of course, that can sound really grandiose. It can sound really strange. What do you mean world creators? Don't we inherit the world as created? We occupy it as it's been given to us. And in many ways, that's right. In fact, existentialists like Sartre talk about the fact that we have to make the most of what's been made of us because we don't start from zero. We don't start from scratch. Heidegger talks about that we are always being in a world. We always find ourselves already in a context of meaning. So it's not that we originate that context. It's what gives rise to the sense of self that we have. Simone de Beauvoir talks about the idea that she was not born a woman, she was made one because of all the social assumptions and social impetus that gave rise to how she then took herself up as an individual. So when we talk about being world creators, this isn't some sort of magic trick where we snap our fingers and just invent whatever we wish were the case. Instead, it's a matter of living into what Friedrich Nietzsche refers to as the death of God. Now, that's not actually an atheistic thesis, as we've talked about on the channel before. It's instead an encouragement to realize that we have to be invested in recognizing the contingency of what we take to matter. The world in which we find ourselves, yes, has been handed over to us by others, but what it reflects are their decisions about what mattered to them. I often talk with my students about the idea that when they first come on campus, they usually will get like a campus map and open it up and try to figure out where they're going, where's their dorm, where's the lunchroom, how do they get to their classes. And I always will take them into the woods behind the university and say, hey, find this tree, find this rock on that map. And of course, they never can do it because on the map, it's just this like big green space. It's, not anything descript. It has no determinacy. And I say, but why is it that we can tell exactly where our dorm is, exactly where the library is, where the football stadium is, but we can't find this tree or that rock? And of course, inevitably, some student will say, because that rock doesn't matter. It matters that we go get lunch. And then I invite them to tarry, to pause with that realization. What does it mean to realize that some stuff just doesn't matter? Well, it means, as David Foster Wallace invites us to think about, that when we learn how to think, the real crux of that is that we learn that we have a responsibility to decide what is worth thinking about in the first place. So they look at this green spot, they can't find the tree, and I say, let me explain to you that even though my courses in college mattered, even though they gave rise to the career that I now have, even though it certainly made a big difference in my life that I kept eating during college, and so I had to find the dining hall, I remember more vividly the tree under which I stood when it started occurring to me that girl who had been dating my roommate and my best friend for all these years, man, maybe I like her in a different way. And that awareness is what then now, 22 years later, has been the backdrop for which our marriage has played out. So I remember the specific tree more than I remember any specific classroom. And the idea is I invite them to try to figure that out for themselves. When we go to college, when we move through life, when we start a job, when we move to a new city, when we simply get out of bed every morning. Though Camus says the question is whether or not to kill ourselves, I think that's probably a little dramatic. The real question is, what will you today decide matters? And that idea is basically an encouragement that my students make their own maps. Go where they think it's worth going. And don't worry if other people think, well, that's stupid. What a dumb place to be. Is it where you choose to be? Are you there on purpose? And so in those big green spaces on the map where they don't know how to find where they exactly are because it's just a nebulous sort of general area, I say, what if you now in that green space start drawing in the rocks and the trees and the trails and the flowers that you want to find and you want to mark and you want to make meaningful for you? I'm sitting today in front of a green screen, not because I'm gonna do some sexy video art to have something emerge behind me, but in order to remind all of us that the green screen is ultimately the context in which we live every day. We often hear about, real world experience being the goal of college education or the goal of internships. It's the thing that parents really want their children to get so they don't have to, move back in with them when they're 25 or 26. But what if we started hearing the encouragement of Nietzsche when he says, in order to be worthy of, to own up to the death of God, do we not have to become gods ourselves? Again, he's not asking some sort of question about atheism and becoming one's own center of worship. He's asking the question of, do we have the courage, the fortitude, and the humility to own up to the task of world creation? Of being aware of our role in making a particular world real. That is hard work. It's exhausting work. In many ways, it's easier, right? If we just accept the way the world's been handed to us, as obvious, as assumed, as given. It's always easier to follow a map handed to us by others than it is to chart our own trail through the woods. And yet, when we are willing to go off the map a little, that's when we might find the really amazing things. Maybe the waterfall is just around a bend that the map actually misses. Maybe the really cool bike trail is the one that nobody's found yet, or maybe it's one that we have to help create. It's one that we have to make sense of as existing where no one else even considers it possible. In many ways, that idea of living in front of a green screen, right, where we get to put on it what we take to be possible, even in light of other people saying no way. When we live in front of that green screen, we take seriously the green places on the map. When we go where everybody else decides is not worth going. That's when I think we become able to recognize that no matter our station in life, no matter our circumstances, no matter the reality of historical marginalization and continued systemic injustice, all of us are tasked with a real, deep significance. And that significance is inviting others into a world that we think is worthy of living in. Right? There are plenty of ways we could understand the world as just not worth our time. But there's also worlds that we can help foster, invite, encourage, develop, envision, that are actually maybe worlds that others want to inhabit. We talk a lot about future generations and our responsibilities to them when it comes to things like climate change. But we don't talk enough, I think, about what it means to make a world, a horizon of meaning, a context in which possibilities play forth, we don't think enough about what that might mean as offered to others daily. When we inhabit kindness instead of egoism, when we open the door for someone instead of charging through, those little moments actually invite a different world, a different normal, a different way. Emmanuel Levinas says, in fact, that the core of ethics reduces simply to the idea of coming to a door and saying, après vous, monsieur, after you. You go first. It doesn't have to all be about me. And in modeling that humility, that preference for the other, I'm inviting a world that looks different than the world that Aaron James describes as filled with assholes. A world in which everybody is out for their own self-congratulatory excess. I don't know. It's sometimes hard to do. It can be exhausting. It's a whole lot easier just to, keep trotting along the paths laid down by others. But it seems to me that if we really dig into what philosophy offers as this amazement by wonder, a willingness to ask questions where everybody else just wants to keep affirming periods. If we really dig into what philosophy invites us into, it is not an abstract, technical, jargon-laden discourse, though it is certainly that for professionals. Philosophy at its most basic, though, is an invitation to live on purpose and recognize that the world in which we live is largely something that we get to shape. In order to shape it well, we have to think about it well. We have to reflect about what goes on in making a world. This is where Walt Whitman really resounds for me when he says, oh, to be indeed a God. Again, he's not talking about making ourselves the object of a community of worship and praise. It's not a heretical claim if you find yourself committed to religion. What he's saying is, do we have what it takes not to simply define ourselves according to some notion of normal that others decided that we now take as absolutely fixed, unchangeable? Couldn't be otherwise. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, 20th century German theologian, famously to me said, we can always do otherwise, right? We can always do otherwise. There's always other options. But how much of our life do we just reduce to the idea of obviousness, of that's just the way the world works. That's just the real world. I once was giving a talk to a bunch of upper management, vice presidents and others, for a pretty big name bank. You'd recognize it if I told you which one it was. And so I was speaking as a keynote speaker at this retreat for some of their leadership. And the talk I gave was trying to invite them to reflect on what they take for granted about banking, about their business, about what they do. And in order to do this, I invited them to think with me about St. Augustine, who basically says that the object of our desire actually dictates much of our identity. We are what we love in many respects. And so I was trying to say, hey, who are you as bankers? Who are you as these members of a community guided by particular sets of desires? So let's do this by thinking about your desires. What guides you? What are your basic principles? What motivates you? What runs this business when it comes to sort of, the fundamental ideas? It was fascinating. In thinking about this with them, one of the people said, I don't understand. You continue to make it sound as if making money is not ultimately the goal. And I said, no, sir. Maybe that is your goal. I'm just trying to invite you to realize it's not the only goal that's possible. We could think about banking differently. And he laughed and said, okay, fine. But capitalism is just the way the world works. And again, I paused and said, no, sir, Capitalism is the way you've decided the world should work. Maybe it's a good decision, but it's not the only option. Until we recognize that we live against a green screen, that there are other ways forward, we will not do the hard work it takes to be responsible to the world that we've been given. Again, we don't create out of nothing. We work with what we find ourselves having been handed. But today, in this bonus video, extra content, it's longer than I would ever do for my regular YouTube channel. It's more informal. It's sort of thinking out loud and inviting you to think with me. Maybe we can all start asking ourselves, what's worthy of my focus? Where do I hope to go and want to draw maps in order to invite others to follow? How do I live a life such that what starts emerging in the green spaces is discreet, intentional, purposive? How do I make others take it seriously that the rock or the tree might be more significant and meaningful to where I am going and who I end up becoming than the dining hall or the dorm? What will the green screen become? That question is ultimately the question of how do we live in light of the death of God and own the responsibility of being world makers. We are all tasked with that. It's hard, and in many ways, some days I don't have it to do. I just kind of keep my head down and follow the path that I'm on. But on those rare moments where we get to repose into the realities of existence, maybe with a good cup of tea, or maybe because somebody charged ahead of you walking into Walmart and did not hold the door for you. And so it caused you to say, man, egoism is real. Do I live out egoism, or am I inviting a different way forward? When people interact with me, am I interrupting that asshole culture, or am I just allowing it to run unabated? Well, you only can answer this for yourself. And it's important that we all encourage each other to recognize that though we are individually tasked with this responsibility, this hermeneutic identity, that who we are is interpreted, and the world in which we occupy our time is itself an interpretation of what could be possible. You've got to do that, but at the same time, we share worlds. What is taken for granted, what is taken as normal, is always something that somebody else has navigated along with me, and in many ways has handed to me. So we're not alone in this individual task. We walk together. And hopefully, as I say often, when we walk together, we can talk along the way. Thank you again for being part of this exciting journey, this world creation that I'm trying to figure out, as I try to move into a space where philosophy is something that speaks to all of us in all kinds of ways every single day. Hopefully I can encourage you, and to be honest, I need you to encourage me. Let's help each other. Let's hold the doors for each other and remind each other that maybe the best maps are the ones that we draw ourselves, and the green spaces or the green screens are in fact really what existential philosophy was always trying to get us to see more effectively. All right, I'll see you next month. And between now and then, please check out the videos on YouTube, send me comments, reach out to me here on the website or over there on YouTube. I would love to hear from you. Anything I can do to try to make the thinking out loud, thinking philosophically together, more relevant to where you are and the issues you're asking and the questions that you're wrestling with, please let me know how to do that, because I would love to make sure that what I'm producing, the content I'm creating, the world that I'm envisioning, and the maps that I'm trying to draw are ones that you find worth your time. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.